get you up on my soul. Came to say thank you, Lord, just for loving me. Many times I do forget every need that you have met. Oh, thank you, Lord, I know you're showing me. You are there when I am down and out. You're holding me. Your love is so amazing. Oh, it changed me. Here I am with all I have. Raise my hands to worship you. I want to say thank you. Oh, thank you for everything, for who you are. You cover me and touch my heart. I want to say thank you. I could have died in my sin, but you saved me. Didn't have any hope at all. You gave me peace divine, strength to carry on. I should have been the one to pay, but instead you took my place. Amazing grace, it's more than just a song. Even though I don't deserve your love for me, you look beyond faults and you showed me mercy. Here I am with all I have. Raise my hands to worship you. I want to say thank you. Oh, thank you for everything, for who you are. You cover me and touch my heart. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for the sun every day. Oh Lord, we want to thank you. Thank you for the rain. Thank you for the love you gave. Here I am with all I have. I raise my hands to worship you. I want to say thank you. Oh, thank you, Lord. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you for everything, for who you are. You covered me and touched my heart. Yes, you do. I want to say thank you. Oh, thank you, Lord. Thank you. I want to say thank you. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. I want to say thank you.
Surrounded by those who have traveled this road, we throw off the heavy and hindering load. The sin that entangles, we lay it aside, and run with our eyes on the one crucified. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men. Consider him, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Consider him, consider him. The author and perfecter of our faith paid the cost. For the joy set before him he suffered the cross. Scorning its shame he sat down by the throne, and smiled as he watched his lost children come home. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men. Consider him, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Consider him, consider him, consider him, consider
Testing, testing, test. Good morning, good morning. We will not really be rushing through this morning, but I will probably try to knock off a few minutes early in Bible class time because I pushed the wrong button back there and our PowerPoint disappeared. So I've got to go find it, hopefully. Or everything that we have prepared all week hopefully is in a trash bin somewhere that I can find. By way of announcements, many of you were with us Wednesday, or perhaps you're already aware of this due to community news. But we mentioned specifically last week the family of Janet Williams and her serious health situation. And just to update you, she did pass away last Sunday night, and her services were finished up yesterday. So continue to remember the family of Janet Williams. That illness diagnosis came upon them as a family very quickly, so that's especially hard. Other newsy and updates that I can pick out. Also, Larry Brown is doing a great job for us on Wednesday nights on the topic of prayer, and he informed me last week that he believes that will carry through the month of July. So if you haven't been able to put that on your calendar yet, you'd like to hear some of the good stuff that he's sharing with us from literally months worth of preparation, be sure and work that into your July schedule. We'll be starting a new topic on Wednesday nights in the month of August. There is mention, I think, of a potluck. Does anybody know anything about that today? Okay, that's pretty common news. And then take note, please, of this week. It's a very busy week on our birthday calendar. Birthdays and anniversaries have a whole lot going on. So if you'd like to interact with some of those folks, please do so. And I'll try to make mention of it at assembly time if I don't forget. But this will be the only week I plan on printing all the phone numbers for our leaders. Sometimes that information can fall into abusive hands, and so if you need those somewhere, this might be the addition to cut that out. If you want to hang them by your phone or get them in your phone book. If you want to keep them with you handy. From this point forward, we'll just be printing the names of our leaders. I believe that's all I have highlighted. Any other updates on events or people? So this is your sister-in-law, and I'm in Arkansas, and her name? Medley. Shelley Medley. Can you spell that for me? M-E-D. Just like you spell it. And she's in Arkansas. So hopefully just medications out of balance, out of whack. But let's add Shelley Medley to our prayer concerns. Thank you, Ginger. Any others? All right. We have delved into Ecclesiastes and have gotten several comments of how it fits into our lives on a regular basis as believers. One of the verses we touched on last week that I ran out of time and didn't go back and spend what I consider adequate time on is chapter 3, verses verse 15. Depending on the translation that you happen to be familiar with or exposed to, that can be a confusing concept there. And so I intended last week to go back to that and get a little bit more input. My New American Standard Translation chose this wording: that which has been already and that which will be has already been. That which is has been already, and that which will be has already been. For God seeks what has passed by. That's kind of a middle-of-the-road translation. The translators go all over the place when it comes to how to put their word order and what meaningful tag, particularly on that last phrase. I think those first two phrases are self-explanatory, and there's not much variance on those. What goes around comes is something that we are familiar with in our colloquial expressions, but that has a different connotation to it. That means justice, you will get your just reward. If you misbehave, somebody will come back and misbehave in your life and mess with you. This is a different concept in the idea that there's nothing new under the sun, which the teacher makes that statement elsewhere in this same book. The cycle of life might be another way of thinking about those two phrases. It's that last phrase that catches our attention with the phrase that God seeks what has passed by. Sometimes that can be a kind of a head-turning phrase or concept. One that I usually go to first off, one translation that I go to first off, particularly when it's in the Old Testament section of Scripture, is called the Young's Literal Translation. And what he did is he went from the Hebrew into as direct a word order simply to English. Took the Hebrew word for word. Sometimes it's phrase for phrase, but most of the time it's word for word, and he puts it into English and then lets you wrestle with it in the English language. This is the way Mr. Young handled that phrase, that verse. What is that which has been? Question mark. Already it is. Almost sounds like Yoda, doesn't it? Already it is. And that which is to be hath already been. And God requires that which is pursued. That even threw more gray on it for me. That which, and God requires that which is pursued. I share that with you because I wanted you to get the gist of the original, as best I understand it, and with that word pursued. There's some good things that have happened in the past, some effective things. And when God sees that that is effective, he pursues that. He brings it and puts it back on the table. So Solomon's observations as he pursued this wisdom, that's the journey he's on, was to go back, was to sit and observe that the principle of deja vu, okay, in a big scale, not just a personal experience, but deja vu of the creation process of God at work in his universe. Solomon observed that. And he says God does things repetitiously. He causes them to happen again, would be another way to phrase that. The World English Bible puts this verse: that which is has been long ago, and that which is to be has been long ago. God seeks again that which is passed away. Maybe that's a little bit more Englishy than Mr. Young's translation. The New Living Testament or translation. What is happening now has happened before. What will happen in the future has happened before, because God makes the same things happen over and over again. Again, to me, I'm falling into my comfort zone now. I can understand that translation, and assuming that that is what Solomon, the teacher, left behind from his pursuit of wisdom, then I think you and I can add that to our repertoire of a wise way for faithful people to look at this earthly or natural man existence. What is our purpose? What is God up to? He's working over and over on his creation. I plug that into my very casual familiarity that when, right out of the gun, right out of the chute, folks were living hundreds of years. And then at some point, God drew the line. Many attest that that's about the time of Noah. From that time on, lifespan got, drastically shorter. And then we have some wise sayings in the collection of wisdom that we're fortunate and blessed if we live to that 80 years, okay? So what was God up to prior to that, and what happened in his plan when he drastically shortened or abbreviated our lifespan? I think, put it in my terms, I think it became quite aware that it doesn't matter how long you live, it matters how clearly you're looking, okay? From a faithful standpoint, how do many faithful people feel when they look at the headlines and they look at life's experiences and some of those things maybe that they themselves have to endure, whether it be physical or even mental or emotional pain and agony, and yet want to maintain that faithful living? What is life to them from their perspective? Man, the sooner I can cash in these chips, the better off I'll be. And Solomon's going to allude to some of that. He's going to say things like, it's better off if I was dead. The unborn are better off than people who experience this. We'll look at that in chapter 4 in just a moment. But that concept could have come into play when God, through the longevity of life, realized that those who had accomplished his goal, folks such as Enoch. Where was Enoch buried? He was not, for God took him. Okay? So there were occasions, and we're not saying that that's a complete story, that that's the whole list, but we know that of Enoch. There might have been numerous others who met that same criteria of a relationship with God in such a way that God said, well, you're finished the journey. I'm finished with you in the laboratory. You have come of age as a spiritual being. And so he called Enoch home. And so, to me, that plays into this concept of the brevity of life, that God is not putting us in a crucible just to watch it boil, or just to watch the steam come off, and see how long we can take this. Many, including Job, have wondered from life's experiences, man, can't the Lord read my heart sooner? What is the testing process? What is the endurance issue when it comes to godly living that God's working on in each of our lives? So the things past and present and to come are all ordered by God. I think that's a good takeaway from the teacher's pen here in chapter 3, verse 15. Any comments or additional observations about that concept? That history, man's experience, including the spiritual realm, is a cycle. And you can see that, if not within generations, throughout multiple generations, you can see history repeating itself, okay? The process of where our nation is going seems to be a concern that many have. And all I continue to warn against is overmuch concern, okay? That's anxiety. And Jesus says, cast all your anxieties on me. Don't be overmuch concerned about the headlines. Don't lay awake at night and wring your knuckles and wonder about the great-great-grandkids and all that, because Solomon has observed, and he shared with us by God's inspiration, he shared with us that God's the one who's in the laboratory creating children in his own image. And the process that takes, and you and I can observe this, is that history repeats itself on the large scale, that nations rise and nations fall, okay? So we, as a nation, particularly this week as we celebrate, we have opportunity to celebrate, and rightfully so, that we are a nation that, at least historically, has enjoyed freedoms and prosperity. And we might say, who knows what is to come? Huh? Israel is a good example to keep our eyes on. When we think of a physical nation, think of Israel and its plight. Much of the struggle that is going on seems to me could be attributed to an artificial emphasis on the physical nation of Israel from a biblical standpoint. God put emphasis on it when it fit a particular scheme or portion of his plan. And when that was fulfilled, Jesus even prophesied prior to his death that there will not be a stone left one on top of the other. And there was never a rebuilding project for Israel, as there was in the Old Testament, where he took them off for discipline under the Assyrian captivity, and then later, hundreds of years later, he took them under the Babylonian captivity. But they had a rebuilding period where God brought them back because the Messiah had not yet come. But when the Messiah had come, what was Jesus' summation? I have come to fulfill all things. Jesus is the culmination of Old Testament Scripture, looking forward to Messiah. He is the Messiah. You go and tell John, he said to the disciples, what you see and hear. Are you the one, or are we looking for another? You just go tell John what you see and hear. That'll be the answer. Jesus was quite confident in his role, not just with the Father, but with humanity, that he fulfilled that calling and that assignment. So, with that as our focal point for this week's activities, however we engage, don't be over much concerned. Enjoy the moment, relish it. That's going to be the takeaway from all of Ecclesiastes' wisdom that Solomon shares. It's going to be live in the moment, okay? When you have an eternal perspective, the purpose of this life fits quite well with God is working on my life. That's what he's doing. So it's not what happens to me or in my life, it's how I respond to that. That is the key to being made in God's image. Am I allowing this life's experience to mold me and make me according to his will? And I think that's one of the many keys that Larry is sharing with us regarding prayer. Deliberately left the sign out by the road, which I'm sure you're aware of now because I've mentioned it enough, that prayer is a steering wheel, not a spare tire. When we think of prayer as a spare tire, go to God in a time of crisis or when we need a big favor, okay, and we think of prayer that way, we've missed the whole function entirely. Prayer is to keep us in line with the will of God. That's why Jesus prayed. I came not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. Well, if he's going to stay in touch with that, he's got to stay in touch with the Father so that the Father can lead and direct him. And we're no different, led by the Spirit. Prayer is one of those key elements. All right. So we're now in chapter 4 and reflecting upon the teacher's observations as he has pursued his purpose in life, which would also be ours, under the sun. Keep in mind his observations are in this physical world. Consider the vanity, he's already considered the vanity of skillful work. And in this chapter, he's going to emphasize that along with isolation, what we might say is loneliness. The monk, the hermit mentality, go live on a mountain, get rid of all the social problems of the world by just going and being your own little unit. And he says, that's a crazy idea, because that doesn't accomplish anything anyway, either, any more than the other. Or of the popularity. Okay, I'm renowned. I'm leaving my mark in history. People will be talking my name for years to come. I find it interesting that the most emphatic thing, and this is just an example, no politics intended, the most prominent thing about the life of such good servants as John F. Kennedy is what? His assassination. Very few people, young or old, know much about what John F. Kennedy did during his few years of leadership. Much of that was the reason, in my opinion, for why he wound up assassinated. He was an ambitious critter. and he was moving mountains and making things happen. And that was rocking some boats, and those boats didn't like to be rocked, and they came back by. And I'm using that as a deliberate illustration because that's some of what Solomon's getting ready to share with us right here. We find injustices throughout our life. So, the preacher reviews in chapter 4, "Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them." So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. That's a showstopper there, is it not? When a man pursuing wisdom observes life and says, not just it'd be better off if I had not been born because of what I'm experiencing, but he says that of the large scale. The folks who have never existed are better off. They're in a happier spot. Now, keep in mind, they've never existed, so this is poetic language, obviously. It's better not to be born than to be born into some positions which he just mentioned are oppressive. You're in the down and outs, and there's nobody there to help you up. You have nobody, no family. You have no friends. You have no resources to help, as we like to think, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, that's easy to say if you got some boots. But when you're shoeless, you can forget that bootstrap idea, okay? Some folks just don't have opportunities like other folks do. That's the reality of life, and that's what Solomon has observed, that there are situations in this life that make the phrase, "those who have not ever been born are better off than some folks who live under this sun," okay, because of their life's experience. And I think you and I, if we're very well read at all from a historical or international level, even a current international level, there are folks who literally walk 7 or 8 miles to the nearest mud hole to get their daily water. We don't relate to that much, do we, when the city sends out their little notices and says, "Your water needs to be boiled." Okay? We still got a tap. We still got conveniences. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's common. That's not an unusual story. There are pockets of culture still living in very destitute situations when it comes to technology or enterprise. Um, and hopefully that's changing. You know, people are becoming more aware of that and reaching out and touching that. One of the most turning moments for me was to be read up in preparation for a youth activity we sponsored in Brady called the Water Walk, is what we named it. But it was a fundraiser for drilling wells in communities where they were walking miles once a day, but they would walk. That was their whole day job, was to go get the water to use for that until they got back with the next bucket of water. That's how it worked. And it was typically ladies carrying jars on top of their heads. You know, that's all the water they could bring back. Had no animals, no burden beasts. They just walked down there, got them a pitcher of water, and walked back, and that was an all-day project. Next, what'd they do tomorrow? Same thing. What'd they do the next day? Same thing. Just to keep the family unit and the community alive. The idea that you and I find, as this teacher did, oppression in our culture. You know, is a theme that is not hard to find if we just open our eyes. I've seen that in every labor and in every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. I'm not going to be slow to throw capitalism out here under the bus. That is exactly what capitalism is. I need the money, and it happens to be in your pocket right now. We dress it up and we call it marketing. But it's basically the same thing as politics. They will tell you whatever they can get by with telling you in order that you'll pick up that product. Well, you know, may not need it, but that was an interesting commercial. That was a cutie, you know, the icon of the Super Bowl commercials, you know. And of late, that has been the only remark I've heard for about the last 2 or 3 years is, you know, the commercials ain't what they used to be. You know, the writers are dying off. Those who actually have imagination and creativity and can relate to this marketing phenomena, they're becoming a rare breed. There's a few out there, and you'll know it when you see one, but it's not like it used to be, where every other or every third commercial was a real eye catcher, something that you hung your hat on. So keep in mind that this whole thing we call competition, and again, in a kind way, since we have a coach in our presence, that's the way I've always viewed sports. It's a momentary thing. You know, I don't really care who's standing on the stage at the end of the year and who has the trophy or the medal around their neck. I enjoy play-by-play competition. I don't care what sport it is. I don't even know who's playing, okay? Just watch the sport. It's a competitive thing. I'll pitch you against this guy or that one, this team against that team, and let's just see who comes out. You got an hour and a half, go. You know, and that's how mundane it is. That's the vanity he's talking about. He says, is that any big deal? Remember, every time that word, all is vanity is used, he's talking about that hevel, H-E-V-E-L. He says, oh, you think that's something? Reach out and try to grab that. There's nothing to it. It's just who happened to be ahead when the time ran out on that given day under those weather conditions, depending on who's on the sick list. That's what a state championship is. Nothing. You reach out and you grab it, and there's really nothing to it. It's just a spot in time that somebody came out on top. And when you put that in the perspective of what we think is the bigger scheme of the economy, it's the same thing. Who's got the most money? Well, on what day, at what time, and what bank, and what resource, and what value are you going to place on that? It's all a chasing after the wind. That's what Solomon's observing. Every piece of competition, who can make the tallest building, who can drive the fastest vehicle, it's just chasing after the wind. There's nothing really to that. Okay? It's just things that keep us busy while we're here. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after the wind. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, no family, having neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity. It's a grievous task. When we think in terms of building an empire, Solomon gets down to the brass knuckles and says, and who you leaving that to? And how much control do you have over their, dispositions? We've come up with some neat little tools like foundations and trusts, but even those concepts are run by someone else that we have no control of, all based on legalities and arguments and conniving. It's all chasing after the wind. There's no substance to it. Then he draws a conclusion: 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. That's the efficiency of synergy. 2 can accomplish more than each of them working individually, doubled. And if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift them up. Furthermore, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. The cord of three strands is not quickly torn apart. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of the prison to become king, talking about the wise lad, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun thronged to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind. He's talking about earthly authority. Under the sun, positions of authority, prestige, renown, resourcefulness, you name it. Wise observation says it's just busyness. You're just spending your time. And when we get on board with what the teacher has observed and how he perceives it, chapter 12, verses 13 and 14 is going to make a lot more sense. We just pull that verse out of the hat because it's one of the few readily available quotables about what living is all about. Fear God, keep his commandments, as God put it. So verses 4 through 6 talks about the vanity of toil and skillful or creative work. One of the things he points out in his observations, or he grasps, is that it's out of envy. It's out of trying to one-up the other guy, be the best one on the block. And then he offers two results of this feeble competition that we engage ourselves in under the sun. He says, the fool does nothing. He says, so why try? If it's all going nowhere, why try? I'll just sit under this shade tree, wait for the worms to eat me up. Okay? And the other reaction in verse 6, it's better to have a little with quietness. It's better to have what I need, my needs of today. Seems to be the answer that faithful living offers, is that rather than to try to climb the mountains and accomplish great deeds, move the mountains, it's a lot better to just enjoy what has come our way. Nothing against this. Wisdom is not saying anything against ambition or building tall buildings or making new airplanes fly. Nothing wrong with that. Just realize it for what it is. It's not getting you anywhere, really. It's just something to busy yourself. The vanity of isolation is his next topic. Loneliness. Each of us, when we find ourselves in positions where there are not others who we can quickly turn to help us out of a bind, it becomes pretty obvious the value of relationships. And that doesn't have to be kinfolks, okay? Many times where family might fail, friends or even strangers will stop by and with a kind heart get us out of a bind. In recent years, that's taken on a phrase of pass it on. You'll find someone else in a similar bind. So rather than taking any kind of compensation or kudos even, just a simple glad I was able to stop and help, pass it on to somebody. So if you come across somebody that's in need, that has a situation that they need a hand for or with, pass it on. Show your gratitude by becoming part of that cycle of life. So the isolation issue is something that makes us aware of this kevel, this vanity, this vapor of life under the sun. Verses 9 through 12 talks about two being better than one. If one fails, the other can lift him up. Their combined body heat can keep them warm. They can withstand those who would otherwise overpower them, so there's safety. And then a good summary phrase that is oft quoted, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. a braided cord. That's the strength of that braid, is that the three knit together in a form that they do not easily come apart. And then he finishes up in verses 13 through 16 with the vanity or the hevel of popularity, of prominence, people with whom we have name recognition. The early part talks about two different guys. It's better to be poor and wise, even though you're young, than to be old and foolish, even if you're the king. Old and foolish is the part, not the king or the youth. Neither one of them really amount to anything. But if you're wise, and if you've experienced poverty, that's going to put a different twist on your understanding of life. If you have that's where we get the phrase, born with the golden spoon or silver spoon in their mouth. That's what's implied by that phrase. It's not that they're bad people. It's just that you've not experienced life like other folks have. So, keeping in mind that the folks who have experienced poverty and yet come out wiser because of it, they are to be preferred rather than just longevity of years. An old king, but he's foolish. He didn't pick up because of his sheltered life or because of his selfish disposition. He didn't pick up on the real meaning of life. The younger man, though poor, he comes out of prison to become the king, and the living were with him. That's a great story. Yes. He came from nowhere, and look where he wound up. And then the culmination of that illustration is, and who's going to follow him? His brother, one of his sons, and there'll be a crowd that follows him too. So the point that was observed by the teacher is that this popularity that we sometimes get caught up in, so much of it, particularly in social media, but it's also in other forms of media, the idea of what's the popular search, what's the trendy thing going on, that popularity concept, he says, is chasing after the wind. There's nothing to it. There's no substance to it. It's just a made-up concept. And so, with that synopsis of life from the vantage point of skilled labor and popularity and wisdom, strength in partnerships, friendships, one of the big takeaways that seems to be promoted here in his observation is the value of relationships. Now, as people of faith, that's one of the things this last Wednesday that Larry pointed out. The relationship that the Godhead has had from into eternity, before creation. They were in let's call it a teamwork conversation where the plural is used in the Hebrew language, let us make man in our image. So just that concept alone ought to kick off the idea that what does it mean to be made in the image of God? He wasn't focusing on power or intelligence or understanding or control, authority. What was the focus there is started out that phrase, relationships. Let's do this together. Let's work on something. And it's quite likely that a part of God's plan, I think fleshed out in the story of Eden, is that after man was created on his own, and he had a little time, we're not told how long, but he had some time to familiarize himself with the other creation that was available to him in that garden. What was the takeaway? God's summation at that point was, it is not good that man should be alone. Let us make for him a helpmeet. someone to finish the project, someone to make this project work. So our journey of faithfulness is a journey that calls us deliberately into relationships. And I'm not talking about biology, okay? I'm not talking about ancestry. I'm talking about people, folks around us. Sometimes, if there's anything that tugs at my heart more in a public arena than seeing someone carry their pet into a restaurant. Okay, now I understand the dynamics of what's going on from a health standpoint and all that. That's not my overmuch concern. My overmuch concern is how can we get to a point where we are so lonely that we befriend an animal and take them inside a public place and sit alone at the table surrounded by people. And that touches me. It lets me know that there's not a whole lot going on. There's not an awareness of relationships. I'm sure they'll wave, say hi, they'll answer their phone if someone calls. So they have this casual thing, but there's no friendships. There's no abiding team, we, let's. There's a loneliness, and that's what the wise teacher observed. He said there's hardly anything in this life that's a deeper pit than the feeling of loneness, of I'm going to be a hermit. I may live among people, but I'm going to be a hermit. I'm going to be kind of a island to myself and move around. And then he maximizes the idea of the advantages of teamwork. Interesting that he uses the concept of three when that's typically how we think of the Godhead. A cord of three cannot easily be broken. There is a dynamic. Having two brothers that are engineering, it passed me all my life until I realized through their conversation that the strongest physical structure is a triangle. You can make one of any number of dimensions, sides to it, but the strongest one is a triangle. Got that piece of information from my brother pre-engineer days, my oldest brother, when he was a draftsman for a truss building company. And he designed the trusses for various housing projects or commercial buildings. But you always came up with a triangle. When you build a truss, it's always going to, if it's going to be strong, you're going to have triangles involved because that's where the strength comes from. A strand of three is not easily broken. All right. Thank you for your time and attention. Like I said, we'll knock off a little bit 5 minutes earlier than I usually do. 2 minutes? I'm sorry. I'm going by that clock. Yeah. But anyway, that's all I got to say because I got other things on my mind. See y'all next week.